Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first installment of the Wesen podcast. This episode will essentially serve as an introduction to what Wesen as a publication is about, and by extension, what this podcast is about. A bit about myself before I introduce Wesen. By profession, I'm a lawyer. I have always been very interested in politics, and I've been watching with intrigue what has been going on in the world lately. In particular, I've been interested in this phenomenon that I call the collapse of liberal dialectics. I will describe what that is shortly. However, I note that it is within that context that I founded this publication. Very briefly for now, Wesen is my attempt at finding a new political voice in the face of the collapse of liberal discourse. So before we begin, one thing to note is that all installments of this podcast are tied inextricably to the written installments of Wesen. So I would encourage you to give those a read as well. You will find a link to the Substack to the Wesen Substack below in the description. This particular podcast is tied to the first piece titled Introducing Wesen, A Way Forward in the Face of Collapsing Liberal Dialectics. So check that out. The written pieces are the most accurate description of my thought. So the plan for this first installment of the pod is the following. First, I will describe what liberal dialectics are, what I mean by them. Second, I will describe what the collapse of liberal dialectics looks like to me. And third, I will explain how Wesen is my attempt to try to find a way forward. So let's get to the first part. What do I mean by liberal dialectics? The first thing to note is that we are living in a moment that I would describe as post-liberal. On the right, we've got people like J.D. Vance, the American vice president, explicitly saying that he is on the post-liberal right. And on the left, there are folks like Zoran Mamdani and AOC who are fundamentally critiquing capitalism in a way that also marks a departure from traditional liberalism, I would argue. Basically, the old rules aren't holding up. The political landscape is fragmenting, and the traditional liberal consensus, the thing that used to hold the political order together, is crumbling. Some commentators like Steve Bannon, even warned of impending civil war. I will also note that this moment in American history is not without precedent. A similar collapse of liberal dialectics, as far as I can tell, unfolded across Europe as well during the interwar period. As we know, during this period, left-wing revolutionaries and right-wing fascist movements clashed violently in the streets of Berlin, Rome, Paris, Vienna, among other cities. This complete breakdown of shared frameworks for meaning and governance eventually culminated in two catastrophic world wars. So a side note here, when I refer to liberal quote unquote, for the purposes of this podcast, I do not mean it in the way that it is colloquially used, where it is usually just juxtaposed to conservatism. For me, liberalism refers to the philosophical superstructure founded initially in the philosophy of John Locke and then developed by further writings of figures such as Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Friedrich Hayek, among others. I would say it is the predominant philosophy of our times, and until very recently, in most Western liberal democracies, both the mainstream right and the left were in this particular sense, liberal. So that is what I mean by liberalism. It's a small L liberalism, I suppose. So what exactly are liberal dialectics then? I think of liberal dialectics as the very way we talk about politics. At their core, liberal dialectics function as, I would say, discursive strategies that legitimize, advance, and preserve a particular socioeconomic order. Basically, these strategies are a form of discourse that preserve capitalism and Western hegemony. And I would say I'm not using those terms in a pejorative or a derogatory manner. I'm using them in a purely descriptive manner. The terms capitalism and Western hegemony. We're often told that liberalism and liberal discourse is about free speech and the marketplace of ideas. As I will explain, I tend to disagree with that. To me, liberal discourse is not really about the seeking of truth in the marketplace of ideas. It is about keeping things in order. And liberal discursive strategies work to do that in a few key ways. So first, liberal dialectics create dichotomies. Within liberal discourse, political debates are always framed in polar opposites. Conservative versus liberal, big L liberal, more versus less immigration, higher versus lower taxes. On the surface, these positions may seem like real political conflicts. But I argue that they act as safety valves to make sure that no particular opinion shakes up the structure too much. If you want to express an opinion under liberal dialectics, you have to couch it in these familiar terms to have any political currency. And as soon as you do that, the potential of these opinions to shake up the structure is taken away instantly. So that is how liberalism creates dichotomies. Second, I would say there's a certain ambivalence that always pervades liberal discourse that provides it stability. So liberal discourse remains forever ambivalent on what is true in the ethical, moral, and the political realm. The only real commitment of liberal dialectics is the maintenance of an existing economic structure, as I argued before. So we notice that Western liberal democracies take an entirely agnostic view on any conception of the good, the true, the worthwhile, or the beautiful. That role is left to unregulated culture, which itself is abandoned to economic forces. That is why I would say that much of the discourse that liberal dialectics produce can rightly be characterized as meaningless fluff. I would say that is most of our news, magazines, podcasts, etc. Right? And so none of these opinions, these ambivalent opinions, really have any revolutionary potential. The third stability-inducing element of liberal discourse is that it is always split into fragments or segments, such that any critique only ever touches upon a specific aspect within liberalism, as opposed to its totality as a system. So this, as I see it, occurs through a very carefully managed system of credentialism. Experts who all inevitably speak the language of liberal dialectics opine on any number of topics such as markets, foreign policy, health, the environment, etc. And more particularly, it is always the opinion of experts that is given credence. If one must opine, he or she must do so in their very narrow field of expertise. For all other matters, you have to trust the experts. As a result of this fragmentation, there is really no space left for holistic structural critiques. And the fourth and final element of liberal dialectics is regulation. I would say liberal dialectics have always maintained a very careful regime of which subjects are acceptable to opine upon and which are not. There are always clear no-go zones. So at different times, subjects such as race, religion, communism, etc. have all been subject to regulation. And cancel culture is the latest instantiation of such no-go zones. So, to conclude, liberal dialectics work in four ways: through dichotomies, ambivalence, fragmentation, and regulation. So, before I move forward and explain how these discursive strategies have collapsed, I do want to offer two clarifications. First, when I refer to liberal dialectics as stabilizing discursive strategies, I do not mean that these are conscious tactics employed by a cabal of shadowy elites to control societies. Far from it. Instead, I would say they represent the way we talk in liberalism as such. They are the default, they're ever present, they're hard to escape. For the most part, we all partake in them without ever realizing that we're doing so, because these strategies are the dominant forms of discourse or dominant modes of discourse. Second, I want to stress that in characterizing liberal dialectics in the manner that I have, I do not mean to criticize or disavow. The characterization above is meant to be purely descriptive and not normative. So that is another thing to keep in mind. So, what's changed? Why are liberal dialectics collapsing? Well, several things have occurred. This is not supposed to be a causal analysis, but here are a few suggestions. Perhaps the single most significant event that ushered in the collapse of liberal dialectics was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Skepticism of expertise in the face of COVID and the proliferation of an almost entirely unregulated social media landscape could be other causes as well. In any event, the effects are abundantly clear. First, traditional political dichotomies simply do not hold up anymore. Who's on the left? Who's on the right? It's very difficult to identify these days. These labels do not have the utility that they used to have. Second, ambivalence as a political strategy has fallen entirely out of favor. People want positions on moral and political issues, clear ones. Any adoption of ambivalence, either on the left or the right, is seen as selling out or shilling. One factor that may explain the loss of Kamala Harris in the recent presidential election, and generally speaking, the collapse of moderate Democrats in the aftermath, is their largely non committal posture on social issues. One that seems to change with perceptions of public opinion. Third, expertise really isn't the gatekeeper it used to be. Comedians, conspiracy theorists, everyone is now legitimately allowed to express an opinion on politics. It doesn't matter, you will be given credence. And finally, we see that liberal regulation is failing in the face of the explosion of alternative media. There's always a platform for your opinion now, and cancel culture simply does not work as a tool. So, with all of that, the old order is crumbling, and there's a gap that needs to be filled. It can either be filled with something positive or negative. And so that is where this publication and this podcast, Wesen, enter. So, Wesen is the German word for being or essence. It is very abundantly used in German philosophy. The idea, though, is very simple. The idea of this publication is to get to the essence of political, moral, social, and economic issues without getting lost in meaningless ambiguity that marks liberal discourse. So, Wesen as a publication will attempt to do four things. First, it will completely shed the false dichotomies that liberalism creates. It's not about being left or right or being politically expedient and advancing a particular agenda. It's about seeking truth as much as one can. Second, this publication will take a structural stance on political issues. looking at systems rather than particular fragments. Third, Wesen will stay open to all perspectives, no matter how out there they may be. And that is going to mount a firm rejection to liberal regulation. And finally, Wesen will not be afraid to take reasoned positions and will avoid any sort of ambivalence. So there will be clear political stances on issues, and they will be well reasoned and well defended. In other words, Wesen is really about having real, honest conversations about the world as it is and how we might move forward. So that is it for today's episode. If this sparked your curiosity, stick around and subscribe to the Substack and this YouTube channel. There's a lot more we'll be digging into in the realm of politics and philosophy, so make sure you don't miss out on that. Thank you for listening.